original Matanka looks like. I brought one from my home. It's a doll that looks something like this. And the history of these dolls goes back thousands of years in Ukraine. The dolls were meant to be magical and to protect people from evil spirits and to provide for fertility and a lot of other things. In any case, let's turn it over to Anya and hear about you.
So I guess the question would be the genesis of my art. I guess the best way for me to say that is that it's been a very slow and organic process, the way that my art has begun. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the daughter of immigrants from Ukraine. And so when they arrived in America, it was for political reasons. And they raised us, I would say, in a very practical way where I probably didn't consider art as an option. I probably grew up thinking there were only 4 careers available. It was doctor, lawyer, engineer, maybe teacher. So having this very practical upbringing, I went into being a social worker and then a psychotherapist. And then when we moved to Ukraine with 3 small children, I was fully inundated in motherhood. So my art began at that time to slowly creep in various ways, from making furniture for the children to fashion design, and then slowly into fabric collages, which is where I guess it started getting more interesting, because I think in retrospect I was connecting with my grandmother, who I had never met, because after the war, when my mother was separated from her at age 11, that she was a refugee in Austria with my grandfather for 4 years at a displaced persons camp before they arrived in America. And unfortunately, my grandmother had been sent to Mordovia to a female labor camp. And so she had lost everything in the process. Her 19-year-old daughter, my aunt, had died in her arms. And so when I began reflecting on her life and the strength that this woman portrayed, and having lost everything and being in a long day of physical hardship, and even at night she was secretly creating embroideries that she smuggled out afterwards and found someone to smuggle them into America. So, and this is all in hope that that they will find her families one day. And I strongly remember the day that my mother got the news that she had died. I think I was 9 years old. And prior to that, they did end up connecting through letters only. They never saw each other again. So having lived in Ukraine and living through the Orange Revolution and then the Revolution of Dignity, all of this had a very profound effect on me. I think what was interesting was probably in the spring of 2013, I decided to take my art very seriously and discipline myself to work on it every day to see where it would take me. So I made our garage in Kyiv a studio. When the children went to school, I went to work in the garage. And at that time, in the process of a couple months, I created 50 portraits of women that just basically flooded out of me. And a friend came over and said, "Oh my gosh, what's going on here? You have to exhibit these somewhere. This is crazy." So we had an exhibit, and almost all of them sold. So it gave me the courage to purchase canvas, because until then I was mostly working on cardboard and paper, and it was less intimidating. And so I guess that was sort of a major milestone in my art, and from there it just went like full trajectory forward from there. And what started, then the Revolution of Dignity, of course, began that winter. And the first thing I did, just in all the chaos, was grab as many newspapers and magazines and all the writings that were happening about the revolution at that time. And one of the first pieces I made was an icon, which I really made intuitively and subconsciously, and later realized that it became very symbolic because one of the embroideries that we received from my grandmother was an unfinished icon. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting, because it's as if I was, out of all the chaos, I was trying to, feel that maybe her icon wasn't finished because Ukraine was not yet realized, and now in the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine is gathering its forces in another direction. And so that was sort of then, of course, the Revolution of Dignity. I mean, for any artist, it takes on a voice of its own, and so I was incorporating in the collages a lot of the people that were dying in the war. And then I suppose my background as a social worker and a psychotherapist was very intrigued by working with plaster of Paris, because this is what we use to treat broken bones. So being inspired by the ancient Maltanka, I started creating this contemporary version of a Maltanka out of this plaster of Paris to add the element of healing in time of war in Ukraine.
Could you tell us how your grandmother in the prison camp, what materials she used to make it?
Yeah, she was taking threads from her clothing, and she used canvas. For the canvas, she used potato sacks, and she used fish bones for needles in order to make these embroideries. So this is the strength and determination that I'm talking about. Exactly.
Thank you so much for sharing that history and the personal story. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, for those of you who have seen any of Aya's exhibits, and I really do encourage you here in New York, if you haven't seen it, to go up to the Whitebox Harlem, and certainly when it opens in Kyiv, to go and see it there. It's really hard not to view your Malcolm kit as an army of benevolent forces. You know, Masha and I were talking about this before the panel, and there's something so disarming about that stance, right? I mean, here is just this army of women figures, and they are not protected from any offensive strikes, and yet they're somewhat intimidating, because they are. You have to think twice to say, like, ooh, what's going on there, So it's almost like the antithesis of war, I think, so far we've spoken a lot about, how art has helped artists express themselves and start maybe that healing process of whether it's, relating to your past and, or getting over a particularly difficult, situation in Ukraine and experiencing war. But the other part of it is, how do people react to it, and how does that help them with their healing process? I mean, did you have any particular thoughts about how you expected people to react, or was it really just an act of personal expression at first?
If I may, I'd like to first just add to thank you for adding the element of the army, because a couple years ago when I exhibited at the Delaware Contemporary, I don't know if this photo will be visible or not, but it was my first series of the Maltan kit. I created 7 Revolution of Dignity Maltan kit, and that's how they were displaced in the installation, as a line in the middle, which gave the feeling of the army, like the front line of the army. But to answer your second question, sorry, what was it of how I...
Did you have any sort of thoughts about how people might react to this? Did you think that they would consider it, would it provide them with hope? Would this be kind of like a talisman?
Yeah. I guess, as we know, I mean, the ancient Maltanka was, of course, a talisman that was handed down from mothers to daughters as a talisman for good health and fortune. And I think that, as an artist, when I first started working, it's really about being open, and so it's not really the first thought of how it's going to be received. It's just you become this vessel for something to take place. But I think over time, as I've seen people come to my exhibits and their reactions, there's very often a very strong connection. Whether they're Ukrainian or not is almost irrelevant. I think people are connecting on a level to, perhaps because it just speaks something, to understand who we are today. We always have to have an element of understanding where it is that we come from, and we're always trying to answer these philosophical questions of what, our whole existential existence and what is our purpose here. And so it helps us, I think, to understand ourselves, our surroundings, and how all these images play a part in what we do in the future. And so I realized over the last few years that this art is much greater than I am, and its purpose serves, a lot of its purpose is, I think, to connect people, connect on a personal level, connect on a healing level, to connect on a professional level. It's connecting us in this discussion panel today, which brings a whole nother level of awareness, because it just multiplies logarithmically as we take it from there, which I think is just a beautiful force.
So true. Before we move on to something else, can you just spend a few minutes talking to us about that lovely jacket that you're wearing, which also there is another one on display at Whitebox, and some other objects which you have transformed and repurposed, which I think really dovetails very nicely into the theme of your exhibit, Metempsychosis. You know, a lot of the things you talked about, transforming sort of your grandmother's spirit and her efforts into sort of the past, coming into the present, and then where does that lead into the future? Tell us about your jacket.
Yeah, I think there's all these, I guess, symbols, metaphors, archetypes, like with my grandmother's situation and with war, and adding art to it in terms of between being stoic and then the movement, and also as a psychotherapist, of course, the straitjackets became very appealing to me. So I've been making a new series of them in the exhibit, and in several others I've had even live models wear the straitjacket in its entirety, with the sleeves still completely covering the arms, because they were used, you know, in hospitals to help people calm down themselves, and so they're not a harm to themselves and to others. And in a contemporary way now, adding the movement and the freedom, I've turned the jacket around and I've opened the arms and added some different forms of art on the back.
Excellent, beautiful pieces of
Thank
art.
you.
Thank you.
Straight jackets.
I know that some people on the Kyiv side have been following Olya's art, and just was wondering if anybody had any additional comments to add in terms of their experience with the art, or if not, we can move on to, okay. So one of the things that you touched on, Olya, okay, go ahead, Masha.
May I make a comment?
Of course.
Thank you.
I was so struck by this jacket on the night I first saw Olya's opening. There was one on the wall, as you mentioned, and then there was also one that she was wearing. And what I was struck by the human capacity to use the very object that is meant to restrain you to be your own freedom. And we see that in so many ways, and that's when we see that in the Black Lives Matter movement. We see that in people owning words that they said someone used to call them, and they decide to own the word themselves in a moment of power. We're even seeing that in the LGBTQ community, that ownership of the word queer that used to be so pejorative, and now they say, no, we're going to own that, and that's going to be ours. And for you to take a straitjacket and a binding force, and certainly it was used in hospitals, but we also know that they can be used in prisons, they can be used to subdue people who are only speaking their mind. So I'm so struck by the fact that you not only changed its power over you or for someone else, but you also made it something that was worthy of exploration as an art object in and of itself.
Thank you for adding those comments, Masha. I thought maybe we could move on a little bit to talk about, or to allow Dr. Susetsky to explain a little bit more about art as therapy and how that helps in the healing process, and to talk about some of the projects in which he has engaged. He was kind enough to show us a couple of pieces of art at the beginning, but it would be great